in the face of a barbarian invasion or a long war against the Samnites or Carthaginians. But to this generation, it all must have seemed like some sort of cruel fantasy. Romans did not come together to help one another out in times of trouble. No, that was when they turned on each other and tried to squeeze partisan advantage out of the situation. Edward Gibbon famously said that being a citizen of Rome in the 2nd century AD was perhaps the greatest time and place to live in all of human history. No such luck for these poor sods, stuck in the last century BC. For them, it was all war, upheaval, and trying to figure out the least bad path through a dangerous and unpredictable time. But the hardship endured by the millions of citizens who were just trying to get along counted for little in the personal struggle between Octavian and Antony, who saw only each other. In late 32 BC, Antony and his recently announced co-general Cleopatra had sailed with their fleet for the Ambracian Gulf, intent on forcing Octavian out of the picture once and for all. But Octavian, who had provoked Antony into action, had no intention of going down easily. Antony and Cleopatra were an abomination, little more than Eastern monarchs who were no more Roman than Pyrrhus or Antiochus or Mithridates. The ambition he had pursued with single-minded purpose for the last decade, sole mastery of the Roman Empire. Beyond the small port town of Actium, the two rivals were about to meet for what would prove in retrospect to be their final showdown. When the spring of 31 BC rolled around, Antony recognized that he was boxed in at the Ambracian Gulf. And before I go any further, I would like to tell everyone that in A History of Rome First, I've actually got maps to go along with this episode. So, if you go to thehistoryofrome.typepad.com, you can download them and follow along visually. If you are driving while listening to this, however, you are not allowed to look at the maps. Safety first. My intention is to try to slowly go back and add maps to the back episodes, and then keep them coming when necessary for future episodes. So enjoy them. I spent a lot of time drawing little tiny triangles, and I hope you find the maps helpful. That said, where was I? Yes. Antony had stowed his fleet in the Ambracian Gulf, and had inadvertently allowed Octavian to park a ground force north of his position, while Agrippa simultaneously blockaded the narrow strait leading out of the Gulf. See it there on the map? Sweet. At first, Octavian sought a quick battle. He deployed his fleet and dared Antony to come out and fight. But short on the manpower he needed to both man the oars of his ships and fight at the same time, Antony declined the invitation. So Octavian settled into siege mode. The Caesarian forces had access to supplies and fresh water, while Antony was cut off from his supply bases in Egypt after Agrippa had captured Methone the month before. Spring gave way to summer, and with the summer came heat, exhaustion, and disease. Dysentery and malaria swept through the Antonian camp, killing scores of men daily. Now it was Antony who decided to offer battle, before he lost all his men to plagues. He hopped over the narrow strait and set up a forward camp just south of Octavian, and from there tried to pick a ground fight. He sent his infantry the long way around the Ambracian Gulf to make a play at capturing Octavian's water source, but the attempt was repulsed. In the midst of the battle, one of the eastern client kings providing needed auxiliaries to Antony deserted. It was a sign of things to come. Over the course of the next few months, Antony's Roman allies would begin taking any opportunity they could to slip over to Octavian's camp, while foreign allies simply took opportunities to head home. By August, things in the Antonian camp had gone from bad to worse. Antony was no longer losing peripheral senators to defection. Now he was losing key members of his senior staff, many of whom cited the presence of Cleopatra in the camp issuing orders as an inexcusable affront. Mostly, though, they just saw the handwriting on the wall and wanted to get out while the getting was good. In mid-August, Antony tried to break out. He sent what warships he could staff out of the strait on a particularly foggy day and tried to surprise Octavian's blockade into scattering long enough to make escape possible for the rest of the fleet. But the attempt failed when Agrippa coincidentally arrived with reinforcements just as the attack was about to get underway. Antony's ships were pushed back. Finally, at the end of August, Antony withdrew back to his original camp and made plans for a head-on collision with Octavian. A ground escape was deemed too risky. Not only would he have to fight his way through Octavian's infantry, but even if he succeeded, he would be faced with a months-long march around the Mediterranean back to Egypt. If, on the other hand, He loaded as much as he could onto as many ships as he could find oarsmen for. There was a real chance that he, Cleopatra, and most importantly, their floating war chest, could make it back to Alexandria and the 14 legions still mobilized there. It was a terribly risky plan, especially after it became apparent that he would be sending just 230 ships against the more than 400 under the command of Agrippa, but there was no choice. He set fire to the ships he could not man so they didn't fall into Octavian's hands. The clouds of smoke were the signal to everyone that a battle was about to begin. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, Antony slowly led his flotilla out of the Gulf, through the narrow strait, and out into open waters. Agrippa and Octavian were waiting for him, with Agrippa, prudently seated over all command of the battle, manning the left flank, and Octavian on the right. Antony hoped to draw his enemies into the confined quarters just beyond the entrance to the Gulf, so their numerical superiority would be muted. But Agrippa had already decided this was a likely tactic, and declined to move in. The morning passed with the two fleets bobbing in the water, waiting for someone to make a move. Finally, Antony was forced to acknowledge that Agrippa wasn't taking the bait. He ordered his ships forward, and the Battle of Actium began. On the Caesarian left, Agrippa worked the ships under his command around so that they swung over and came at Antony from the north. To counter, Antony shifted his own line so that what had begun as a north-south line was now an east-west line. This all had the effect of leaving the center of the Caesarian line open. With Octavian fully engaged in the southern theater and unable to close the gap left open by Agrippa's enveloping move, Cleopatra saw her opportunity. She had been held back from the main line with 60 ships and had thus far taken no part in the actual battle. This was by design, as her flagship was the key to the whole escape, because on it was the Antonian treasury. Even if every ship but hers was captured, there was still hope. With the afternoon winds blowing out to sea and the middle of the battle open, Cleopatra hoisted her sails and fled the scene. Seeing the queen lighting out, Antony quickly transferred himself off of his lumbering flagship onto a quicker vessel and followed her. He could only hope that the rest of his fleet would disengage and follow. If they couldn't, at least they had bought their general and his fortune time to get away. For the most part, they couldn't get away. Outnumbered and hemmed in, the ships that weren't sunk were forced to retreat back into the Gulf. After an evening spent out at sea making sure no one slipped away, Octavian surveyed the scene when dawn finally arrived the next morning. Cleopatra had obviously gotten away, but he had no idea what had become of Antony. 40 or so of the Antonian ships had been sunk, and the 130 left were now cowering in the Gulf. All in all, it was a clear victory. Mitigated by the escape of Cleopatra, obviously, but Octavian had succeeded in dealing Antony, wherever he was. The next week was spent mopping up after the battle. The 130 trapped ships surrendered without much convincing, but there was still a sizable Antonian infantry in the area that needed to be defanged. Unable to fit everyone onto the 230 ships, Antony had left some 50,000 men under the command of the intensely loyal Publius Canidius Crassus on shore. Crassus had orders to march them back to Macedonia in the event that Antony was able to make good his escape, and from there, attempt the overland march to Egypt. But the soldiers had other ideas. At first, they waited for Antony to reappear, not understanding that the whole point had been for him to get out of Dodge, not fight a battle to decide the war right then and there. When it became clear that Antony was dead or had fled, the attitudes of the troops changed dramatically. Over the head, or I guess maybe under the head, of Crassus, the soldiers offered to surrender to Octavian if they were treated as if they had been on the winning side the whole time. Octavian jumped at the chance to nullify the sizable threat they posed, and maybe demonstrate some of the famous clemency that had won his uncle so much acclaim. He was fast coming to the realization that maybe power was finally in his grasp. He needed to start thinking like a statesman if he was going to be the master of all Romans. He accepted the terms and agreed to demobilize the legions with all the honors and spoils that were due his own men. Disgusted, Crassus and a few senior officers packed their bags and slipped away back to Alexandria, where they hoped to find plans to reverse the setback at Actium well in the works. Octavian himself was in no great hurry to chase after Antony, who, it was now known, had made his way out of the battle and followed Cleopatra back to Egypt. He settled in for the winter on the island of Samos in the eastern Aegean and made preparations for the invasion of Egypt he would undertake when spring arrived. Meanwhile, he sent home thousands of Italian veterans who had completed their service time. Unfortunately, though, the spoils and land they had dreamed would be theirs when they got home were nowhere to be found. Once again, the bank had been broken. The veterans began to agitate violently against this injustice, and Agrippa was sent back to pacify them. But even the great general, who had the respect and admiration of all the mutinous ex-soldiers, could do nothing to settle them down. Octavian was forced to return to Italy himself to deal with the situation. When he arrived in Brundisium, it seemed like the entire population of Rome was there to greet him. In a sign of the times, rather than greeting the returning Octavian at the gates of Rome, as would have been the custom, the entire Senate traveled down to the southern port to greet him as his ship docked. It was clear who Rome thought would be their eventual master. Octavian issued IOUs to his angry troops. It was all he could do, and promised to settle everything when Antony was disposed of for good. They accepted his word. There was really nothing else they could do. But not everyone in Rome was so quick to embrace Octavian. The young Marcus Lepidus, son of the former triumvir, decided to hatch this decade's liberator plot. He began the process of acquiring support, just as Brutus and Cassius had done, and started making plans to assassinate Octavian as soon as he came back to Rome. But Maecenas, left once again in control of the city, caught wind of the plot and swiftly extracted the names of everyone involved. There would be no repeat of the Ides of March on his watch. Lepidus and anyone foolish enough to join him were executed without delay. Confident that things in Italy were well in hand, the spring of 30 BC arrived, with Octavian focused on Egypt. Envoys of all kinds, some from Antony, some from Cleopatra, some from independent factions within Alexandria, had been seeking him out all winter to try to avert the invasion. But Octavian had made up his mind. He didn't want to just destroy Antony and Cleopatra. He wanted to seize Egypt and hold it for himself. No negotiations, no bribes, no settlements. Straight-up annexation and under his personal control. The only way to make sure that happened was to take the country by force. Over the winter, things between Antony and Cleopatra had deteriorated. They still had money and troops, but they were trapped in Egypt without any hope of escape or further aid from any of the client kingdoms of the East, all of whom were now under Octavian's influence. Antony refused to bow to the inevitable and continued making plans for the defense of Alexandria, but it was clear that Cleopatra began to pull away from him, perhaps thinking about life past Antony. If she was thinking she could perhaps latch on to Octavian the way she had latched on first to Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony, she was deluding herself. But their survival instinct is strong, and cornered like rats, both Antony and Cleopatra entertained pleasant fantasies where they somehow made it out of this alive and in power. But as we know, they did not make it out alive or in power. When the spring came, the first piece of bad news arrived. 4 legions stationed west of Alexandria had defected and were now marching towards the city on Octavian's orders. Octavian, meanwhile, was leading his own forces through Syria and would soon be coming at Egypt from the east. If there was one thing Octavian truly loved, it was a pincer move, and the invasion of Egypt was just another fine example of it. Antony made his way out to the defected legions and tried to win them back to his side, but they forced him to retreat empty-handed. Octavian encountered little resistance from the Egyptian troops who were supposed to be guarding the frontier, and was soon knocking it out